Welcome back for Chapter 5. Luke and Jenny looked around. They were now sitting on a wooden pew at the back of a little church. It didn't look that different from the church their family went to. It was just a bit smaller, and the people were dressed in their Sunday best. The men in suits, the ladies in long dresses. The men had removed their hats. Jenny looked over at the swamper and noticed he was taking his hat off too. It's considered bad manners for a gentleman to wear his hat indoors, he said, especially in church. He went on to tell them that this little church was in the town of Contention, a few miles away from Tombstone. I've never heard of a town called Contention, said Luke. Doesn't exist anymore, Luke, said the swamper. About all that is left of Contention are a few foundations. Now watch carefully. You're about to see something that's truly shocking. Luke and Jenny turned to watch the preacher standing at the pulpit. He was in the middle of preaching his sermon. And the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. He was suddenly interrupted by the sound of the church doors bursting open. Luke and Jenny turned around to see Curly Bill and one of his cowboy friends walking into the church with their guns drawn. The congregation looked stunned. Some of them were so pale that they looked like they might faint. Bill's been celebrating his release from jail. He and his friends have been out drinking all night, said the swamper. They've already caused a lot of trouble, and now they're going to see how much more they can get into. No one said a word as Curly Bill and his friend walked up the aisle to the preacher, who stood behind the pulpit. They looked at one another for a moment, and then Curly Bill addressed him. Reverend, I've heard it said by folks around here that you're a good man and that you're strong in your Christian faith. So I've decided to come here and see for myself. Please, go on telling these good folks about this Lord of yours and pay no attention to me. Whatever he's up to won't be good, whispered Jenny to her brother. Yeah, that's probably having to make up for things as a ghost. Luke whispered back. And look, they're not even taking off their hats. Curly Bill kept talking to the preacher. Now you stand perfectly still. The minister nodded. And as long as you don't move, you won't get hurt. But if you do, well, then I guess this congregation will have to do without a preacher. Now go back to what you were preaching. The minister took a deep breath and began to speak. And the day of the Lord... His words were suddenly broken up by the loud, banging sound of gunfire. Curly Bill and his friends were firing their guns at the preacher. But he stood very still and kept on preaching while the cowboys shot out some of the church windows. The walls behind him and on both sides began to collect bullet holes too. Some of the shots only missed the preacher's head by an inch or two. Luke and Jenny held their breath as they watched, and Jenny covered her ears. But somehow, amid the noise of all the gunfire, the preacher managed to finish his sermon. The congregation sat and watched in horror. None of them were armed, and Curly Bill and his friends were much too dangerous for any of them to try to take on. After the minister was finished, Curly Bill looked at him. Well now, you have shown all of us that you indeed are a man of strong faith, and you know your Bible quite well. Now step down here, my good friend. The minister hesitated. It's all right, said Curly Bill. Come on down from behind that pulpit so we can all see you. The minister slowly stepped down as Curly Bill gave his next command. Now dance for us, my good friend. The minister grew pale. I can't dance, he replied. It's against the teachings of my faith. Curly Bill smiled and said, Oh, that's all right. Somehow I think your Lord will understand. Then his face hardened, and as he raised his gun, he said, But you will dance for me. The minister knew he had no choice. If he did not dance for Curly Bill, then he would certainly find himself facing his gun once again. Only this time, he knew that Curly Bill would not miss. So he began to slowly shuffle his feet, then he shuffled them a little faster. He kept going until Bill finally told him it was time to stop. Curly Bill turned to face the congregation, who had been sitting in silent fear. By this time, Jenny had had enough. She got up from the pew and stormed to the front of the church. What is she doing? Asked the swamper. He knew Curly Bill could not see her and would not be able to hurt her. He just wondered what she was up to. I've had enough of you, she shouted at Curly Bill. Do you think that picking on people who can't defend themselves makes you a big man? Well, it doesn't. That makes you a bully. And do you know what bullies are? Losers. You're a loser, Curly Bill Brocious. That's spelled L-O-S-E-R. She kicked Curly Bill in the shins. Luke snickered as he watched Jenny's foot go right through Curly Bill's boot. Next, she looked over at Bill's friend who was standing nearby. And that goes for you, too. You're both a couple of losers. Well, Luke, Your sister certainly has a lot of spunk, said the swamper. Luke looked a little embarrassed. Yeah, she's bossy because she's the oldest. But she's right about one thing, Luke, said the swamper. Picking on people who are weaker than you doesn't make you strong at all. It just makes you a coward. In the meantime, Curly Bill, totally unaware of Jenny, looked at the people in the congregation. You people do indeed have a very fine man to lead you, which pleases me very much. Now, Reverend, carry on. He motioned to his friend to come with him, and the two calmly walked out of the church. Jenny stood at the altar for a moment in stunned silence with everyone else. Then she came back to Luke and the swamper. I can't believe anyone would ever do something so awful, she said, especially to a minister and in a church. What was Curly Bill thinking? Well, Luke and Jenny, said the swamper, that's just the way Curly Bill was. He was a wild man, especially when he drank, which was much too often. But the funny thing was, when Bill was sober, he was a decent fellow. I guess he fell into a bad crowd when he came here, or maybe the other cowboys just brought out the worst in him. Bill lives up near Gaileyville, which is another town not too far from here. Something is about to happen there that will make Bill even more of a legend. The next thing they knew, they were sitting at a table in a saloon. Look at the bar, pointed the swamper. Bill and some of his friends are having a drink. The saloon doors opened and a man entered. That's Deputy Sheriff Billy Breckenridge, said the swamper. Would you believe me if I told you that the deputy and Curly Bill are good friends? Luke and Jenny shook their heads. Well, believe it, and Bill is just about to prove it. See that other man over there, the one in the blue shirt? Luke and Jenny nodded. His name is Jim Wallace. He's also one of Curly Bill's friends, at least for now. As the deputy came up to the bar, Jim Wallace looked up and yelled an insult. The saloon was so noisy that Luke and Jenny couldn't make out what he had said, but whatever it was, the deputy left, which made Bill angry. He walked up to his friend and started shouting at him, You go back outside, bring that deputy back in and apologize to him. Jim Wallace did as he was told. After all, it was never wise to argue with Curly Bill, especially when he was angry. But this time, Bill was so irate that when his friend brought the deputy back, he laid into him again. You know, Wallace, you really are nothing but slime, so I've decided to kill you anyway. Jim Wallace must have thought it would be best to leave. He stepped outside with an angry Curly Bill following him. Luke and Jenny heard them arguing outside. The swamper stood and motioned Luke and Jenny to follow. Just as they got outside, Jim Wallace fired his gun at Curly Bill. The bullet hit Bill in the neck and came out his right cheek. Whoa, I bet that hurt, exclaimed Luke. He and Jenny watched Bill fall to the ground, and just like after the shooting of Fred White, the townspeople quickly came running to the scene at the sound of gunfire. Deputy Breckenridge arrested Jim Wallace before more trouble began, while the cowboys carried Bill off to the doctor. Is this how Curly Bill died? Asked Jenny. No, said the swamper, but it will start a rumor that he had. Curly Bill is one tough guy, and even though he was shot clean through the head, he makes a full recovery. This adds to the legend of Curly Bill because after this happened, some folks believed that Curly Bill was so tough and so bad that he could even come back from the dead. Are you going to show us more of the things Curly Bill did? Asked Luke. I could, and Curly Bill certainly did a lot of things to make trouble, but we don't have time for everything since I have to get you back to that bench on Allen Street before your mother finishes her shopping. Right now, we're going back to Tombstone so you can meet the real Wyatt